Hello everyone, welcome to what I hope was a long-awaited video, Lecture 9, the infinitive. Just to give you an overview of what we're doing, as per usual, we will be covering portions of chapters 5 and 6 in Hope. Now, we're not covering all of it in this video. There's other stuff, things like numbers, the nomenclature of the king, which is quite an important topic in Egyptology, as you might guess, that are covered in chapters 5 and 6 that this video will not go through. But this will focus exclusively on the infinitive, with the other ones to be covered in what is most likely going to be the next lecture. And this is because the infinitive is, as we're going to see, quite important and quite difficult as a topic to cover. I've mentioned earlier that verbs in Middle Egyptian are quite difficult from the perspective of a native speaker of English or another Indo-European language, that they simply don't work intuitively for one such as I. As such, please pay attention to this video. This is the first verb form we get that starts to get a little confusing, where that statement I made earlier really starts to become true. And the only remedy for it is being watchful for all the details of the different verb forms, like the infinitive and the ones we'll learn later, the perspective and the particle and the second tense and all of those, or participle, not particle. And learning how to distinguish each one and where it appears and what it means, because otherwise you, like I was at one point in my studies of Egyptian, will become desperately confused about all the different kinds of verbs and what they do. So please pay close attention, more so to this video than you would to others. I would hope you're paying attention to these videos if you're watching them, but especially this one, because this will be critically important moving forward. So, brief overview of the infinitive. The infinitive is a basically nominal form of the verb, by which I mean it appears where and as a noun does. Contrast the basically adverbial circumstantial form, which appears in places where it modifies something, either that you particle or another circumstantial clause. The infinitive can act as a subject of a verb, or its object, or as the object of a preposition. You know, all the things that a noun would typically be doing. Now, the name infinitive might be a little misleading to an English speaker. In English, the infinitive is the to be or to run or whatever form of the verb, always preceded by to. But in working with Middle Egyptian, you'll find that's basically never the correct translation. Usually, you're going to use something like the gerund, the ing form. So our base verb is sejem, to hear. Then if sejem, hear, is how we translate our circumstantial, you know, he hears, she hears, I hear, whatever, then we would translate it as hearing, the act of, you know, receiving auditory information and processing it. And the same applies for other verbs. It will in general be a gerund, although sometimes, you know, for the verb emerges, for example, Hope translates it as emergence rather than emerging, just because that's a little closer to the English idiom. But all in all, same kind of thing. The infinitive is differentiated in certain forms of the root from other verbal forms in that it isn't always strictly the dictionary form. This is quite helpful, as it makes it easier to identify for some verbs. Now, it's no help for the bi- and triconsonantal strong roots or for the second geminating. They are their dictionary forms: sejem, jed, kabeb. There are a couple exceptions. S causatives, which we'll get into later. They're biconsonantal verbs preceded with an S. They generally have meanings like to cause, to be, or whatever. There's a little more subtlety to them, but suffice it to say for now that they tend to take T endings in the infinitive as well. So semenet rather than semen for the verb meaning to cause, to be firm, or to make firm. Third and fourth week is where it gets interesting. Iri, to do, becomes iret, doing, and hemsi, to sit, becomes hemset. sitting. The final consonant is always replaced with a T. The irregulars follow a similar pattern, almost all of them. Oh, my apologies, my cat walked on my mouse. Shemet, Eet, Ewet, Enet, and Redit all are given a T ending. Only one of our irregular verbs, ma'a, to see, doesn't take a T ending. It's either in its dictionary form, loses one of its alepphs, or takes an N ending. That's not like an arbitrary letter, by the way. The sounds of aleph and N seems to be confusable in Egyptian. That's a reasonable writing for what the infinitive of this verb would have sounded like. So the first use we're going to get to, not a super common one, is the infinitive as a subject. Not, again, super common, but because grammatically the subject tends to be near the head of the sentence, I wanted to put it first. Tends to take the form of having a verb and a verb right next to each other when it's serving as the subject of a verb, or an adjective followed by a verb, as in our example, when it's serving in a sentence with a predicate adjective. So in this case, our sentence is ach, sejem, en sa. There's no determinative on ach as there should be, but otherwise, sentence is all good. Ach means good or useful. Sejem is, of course, to listen, but in this case, because we have an adjective followed by the verb, that means it must be an infinitive, because only a noun can follow an adjective in a sort of sentence like this. And ensa means for a son or for the son, which we already knew. So this just renders as listening is good for a son or for the son. Remember, no articles in Middle Egyptian, so we'll fill that in as we please. This one is in Hoke, just breaking it down for you. Infinitives can also serve as objects of verbs. This is a pretty common place to find an infinitive. Tends to be especially true with verbs meaning like command or see. One might, if you command the building of a temple, the building, in this case, is an infinitive. And then similarly, if you see someone approaching, you see the approach of the king, well, approach is going to be in the infinitive in the Egyptian idiom. So this is a common place to find it, especially with a couple of particular phrases where it will just make a lot of sense. It will look like verb, noun, verb, or verb, pronoun, verb. Remember, with our subject, the verbs touch. But in this case, there's going to be the subject of that verb separating it from the infinitive. That will either be a suffix pronoun, because remember, if it's a subject, it has to be a suffix pronoun, or just the regular noun acting as the subject of the verb. There's a special case involving redi that needs to be talked about. When redi is used with an infinitive as the object of redi, it means to grant rather than to put or place. Not hard to see how this meaning evolved, but it's important to know so you can get accurate translations. So for example, redi f enek iret. This one, so this is a rule about word order that I didn't really talk about, but that a prepositional dative will precede the direct object. So the direct object is still iret. He grants to you the making, ... and then it would be followed by something. Just good to know because redi is a pretty common verb, and this is something that will show up, so important to remember. The real fun thing with infinitives, the thing where they get the most use and where you're going to see them the most often, is as the object of a preposition. Again, because infinitives are nouns, you can put them as the object of a preposition. That's not a surprise, but the interesting thing here is the meaning of those combinations is not always immediately obvious from the preposition being used. So we'll need to go over all the examples that Hope gives just so you know what you're dealing with. R plus infinitive has a couple meanings. One of them we're going to get to in a minute, but generally, it can express purpose. Iret means in order to do something. And we're using iret there just as a dummy verb because iri does mean to do. So seja means in order to hear. You would say at the front of the class, in order to hear better. Sejem nefer. Or sejem. Yeah, I guess you wouldn't even really use a comparative there in Egyptian. Chefet plus the infinitive means when or upon, like at that moment. So chefet per. Per means to arrive, biconsonantal verb, no change. With chefet, it means upon arrival. So upon arrival, something happened. Emchet plus the infinitive, the prepositional phrase means after. So, emchet ma'a, after seeing. Emchet ma'a, maybe set. Or emchet ma'a, see, after seeing him. And then there are a couple others that we need to cover, but we need to cover them in a substantial amount of detail because they get complicated, because they do what we would expect of a whole tense with just a single preposition. So we're going to go over a couple other things about the infinitive first before we move on to that. Infinitives can have what Hoke calls a logical subject. This is the thing where if it were a verb, you would expect it to be the subject of the verb. But it's not a verb, it's a noun. And it works with the primary way that nouns relate to one another, genitivally or possessively. So in this case, you have peret chem necher, which means something like at the going out of the chem necher priest, or as the chem necher priest was going out. Can be progressive with this particular form, but it is not necessarily so. In any case, the important thing to take away here is that hem necher is being possessed effectively by the infinitive of the verb peret. Yes, this is just at the going out. Also, my apologies. I believe this pair earlier was a typo. It should be parrot. I think the verbal root is peri, not pair. My apologies on that. Infinitives can also take a logical direct object. That is also a genitival relationship. It is substantially more common than logical subjects. It is only possible with transitive verbs, as you'd expect, because only a transitive verb, by definition, can have a direct object in the first place. And it usually also uses a suffix pronoun. So you wouldn't say iret set for making it. You would use iretes, just the suffix form, because again, it's genitival. And then the noun, it can also take a noun, which is again being possessed in a genitival relationship. Logical indirect objects, not very different from the logical direct objects. It is almost a more adverbial relationship, though, because you are using a prepositional phrase. You're using n plus the indirect object. Also requires a transitive verb. Not very much to say about it, because it's something you'll see, but it's something that will be pretty immediately intuitive, because a noun being modified by a prepositional phrase really is nothing new. There's also a particular use of the infinitive, which is called something like the caption infinitive, because much like in English, in Egyptian, it is possible to use an infinitive or gerund, in English's case, to caption an image. You might, if you have a picture of somebody running, and you could caption it running in the park or whatever. In Egyptian, this is also possible. you effectively make a nonverbal sentence without you and with an infinitive as the subject. Iit sa nesu is the return of the prince, for example. The true nonverbal sentence equivalent of this would be you iit sa nesu, which would be something like the return is of the prince, or perhaps you would put something else on, make it possessive. The return of the prince is whatever the rest of it is. But you can just drop that you, leave it as such, and it's perfectly fine Egyptian grammar. Two prepositions are used for ongoing action. That is to say, progressive action, something like the English ing form and how it is commonly used in the present perfect. These prepositions are her, usually meaning upon, and em, usually meaning in. Now, em only works with verbs of motions, or verbs of motion, pair and that kind of thing. Otherwise, it can mean in or by. Em jed even means quote. Her sejemef is he is hearing. That's a pretty typical example. The progressive infinitive is grammatically adverbial, looping back around to working more or less how the circumstantial works, and it can be used in circumstantial clauses. It can begin them something 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 her sejem while he is hearing, etc. And we will get some examples of that when we go over examples of this in a couple lectures. And oh yes, I do have an example here now as well. You eat chen her wenem ta. You eat, or you, well, we know you. Eat, there is an F there, but you don't say it. That means father. Chen is a suffix pronoun. Your, meaning plural in this case. So your father, her wenen. So we remember wenem is our infinitive because it's a verb, but there's a preposition in front of it. Her means it's progressive, and then ta, bread. So your father is eating bread. Pretty simple sentence, not too hard to parse out. You won't have a tough time with the progressive infinitive, but it's something that needs to be discussed. Then there's another tense that gets accomplished with the infinitive, which is the future tense. It takes the form of uf er sejem, he will hear, similar to the R of purpose, which we already know about, but it puts the whole thing in the future. It's not just that you want to do something or intend to, but that you will do it. Not a big leap, but it operates as the future tense and follows the rule of circumstantial clauses, as do the other ones, and that it can begin one. So in this case, we have you depet, just a boat, air. So we know we're dealing with a future tense thing. Er iit em henenu. A boat will come from home. Em in this case is serving as from, effectively, is best translated, but the Egyptian idiom demands an em. And iit is, of course, our infinitive. That's all we have for this video. I do promise that this channel is still happening. It's going to be happening slowly, but it will be happening. And our next lecture will be everything in chapters 5 and 6 that I have not talked about yet.